everyone, welcome back to Z Talks with your host, Zaria Musgrove, where I talk about books, movies, and TV shows that relate to history and classic literature. Now, today I will be diving into the book side of the podcast, and I am probably sure you would have heard about the book that I will be talking about today, which is The Woman by Kristin Hannah. Now, this book has been going around different book lists to read for this year, as well as different TikTok videos. It's really popular, and I decided to read it because it crosses over into themes that I really like to explore in my book, which is historical fiction. So, it being popular and actually looking at historical fiction, I was like, let me give it a shot. I read it, and suffice to say, because I'm making an episode on it, I have some thoughts. And I don't really want to go into my thoughts in the intro, so I will just say, without further ado, let's get into it. Now, as I said, The Women by Kristin Hannah actually is kind of historical fiction. It is set in the Vietnam War, and we start out the book in 1967 following our main character called Frankie McGrath. Now, she is a nurse. She is a newly certified nurse who comes from a really affluent family. She is a white woman and lives in an affluent neighborhood, upper middle class, and her family has a history of serving in the wars. She comes from a family of veterans. And her brother is following in the family footsteps and going to Vietnam to serve. Now, Frankie was never really expected to serve as uh, anything in the war, actually, because they don't really give women the credit in her family for being veterans. The only women that are actually recognized as serving in the war are the women that were wives of the people that went to the war. So you can really tell how they place and value women in her family. And because of that, she wanted to go to the war to just be recognized by her family as a veteran, and to also go with her brother because they are born pretty close together in years. They're around similar ages and they're really close. And she can tell that her brother is scared to go to the war, so she follows him to go to the war. But just before she goes, in hopes of meeting her brother over there in Vietnam, she finds out that he has died in combat, which is crushing to her, obviously, because that's one of her closest friends, her brother. But she still goes to Vietnam, and the whole book is about her story going over there and honing her craft, being a nurse, and also love. This book also has a love story in it, multiple love stories of her finding love in Vietnam, losing love in Vietnam, and also story of friendship because she meets two friends over there, Ethel and Barb, who are also nurses, combat nurses that treat people who have grave injuries. Now, this is the part where I will say that this book is actually really graphic. So if you've ever thought about reading it, just know that it is really graphic because she is a combat nurse. She describes in details the people that she is helping, like bullet wounds, people losing limbs, people being severely burned, because obviously in the Vietnam War, there is biochemical warfare with Agent Orange. So people are being burned beyond recognition. And this is something that she faces having to deal with as a combat nurse and actually helping people. So just bear that in mind when you want to read this book. This book is super graphic, and if you are triggered by really graphic wounds and blood and being described in detail about grief and death and how people are constantly dying, maybe this is not the book for you. So I would say to keep that in mind. But also, granted, that is only half of the book, because this book, which I did not know before reading, has two parts. And this is actually where I will come to my thoughts and rating to the book. Now, I actually usually leave my thoughts and rating about a book until the end of the book, but for this episode, I actually have to put my thoughts and ratings about the book right here, right now, because the thoughts that I said I had about the book in the intro are not entirely positive. I didn't entirely enjoy this book because all of the stuff I just talked about is the first half of the book. This book goes through a dramatic change in pace, a dramatic change in not plot, but I would say focus, kind of like halfway through the book where we go into part two. Because part one is about her being on the front lines, treating people who have severe wounds and friendship and love in Vietnam. Part two is about her coming home and trying to reintegrate in society as a normal citizen after being in Vietnam for 2 years because she served two tours. So you go from a high stress situation to coming back to being a normal citizen and just trying to reintegrate and find a normal life. And as you can guess, this is really hard for her because she has PTSD. So, part two looks at her journey dealing with PTSD and also facing substance abuse from really struggling with that. And because of this focus on her struggles with substance abuse and mental health and trying to seek help, it takes a slower pace. So part one is really fast paced, like it's a mile a minute, every page something is happening. Part two is really slow paced. It kind of really takes you with her through every single day. Like we have more time jumps in part one. Part two is kind of on a day to day basis where we're going with her and her struggles every day. So it's more of a slower pace. And I won't lie, I really kind of really didn't enjoy that slow pace. I love a fast paced, plot driven book. So that is one reason that I really didn't like part two as much as part one. But one main reason that I didn't like the book overall, and which will come to my rating now, I will actually have to rate the book 3 out of 5 stars because of one main problem I had with the book. The book is called The Women. It's called The Women. So I went into this book really thinking that it would focus on the women, but I was hugely disappointed. I was facing a major letdown because the book really didn't focus on the women. Yes, it followed a woman, a singular woman, Frankie, moving through life, going through her struggles in Vietnam, and coming back home and reintegrating. It followed a woman. But it really focused on her experiences in her love life more than anything else in the book. Like we follow her through the book, chasing love, finding love, losing love, more than actually focusing on the friends that she made. Because remember, I said she made friends in Vietnam. Ethel and Barb. We really don't hear much about them. They serve as characters in the book mainly to the end of providing her support. We don't really hear much about other women in the book in a sense of them having their own story and actually living their own lives and experiencing their own struggles through going in Vietnam and also resettling back in the US as being a veteran. We don't get other women's experiences. We only see that of Frankie. And to a certain extent, I would have been okay with that because obviously there are books that focus on just the main character. But I wasn't okay with that because this book says the women. It's plural. Women. It should be more than one woman's experiences. So I really was hoping to hear about Ethel and Barb, her friends, their experiences. But you only hear about them when they are there to support her after she has been done dirty Done dirty, by the way. She's done dirty so much times in this book by men through romantic experiences and also by her own father through not recognizing her as a veteran and actually giving credence to the things that she experienced in Vietnam. So we see her done dirty so much times by men. And when she's done dirty, that's when her friends come in the capacity of supporting her. But do we hear about their struggles with PTSD? Because I'm sure they also experienced PTSD because they also went through such traumatic experiences. And even if they didn't go through PTSD, do we hear about their struggles of reintegration? Because, mind you, Ethel and Barb, Ethel is also a white woman, but she comes from a different socioeconomic status. Frankie is basically a rich white woman. She had different experiences than her friends. Ethel grew up on a farm. She is not as affluent and rich as Frankie is. So her experiences and her life of reintegration after Vietnam would have been totally different. But we didn't really hear about that. We only heard that she got married and had a baby, which is trivial. And we didn't hear much about her struggles about that at all. And Barb, which for me was the biggest letdown in a character ever, Barb is black. We didn't hear much of anything about her racial struggles at the time of reintegrating in the States after Vietnam at all. And if you know anything about this time period, okay, if you know anything about this time period, I think, don't quote me on this, but the main character reintegrates into the States in 1971, I believe, early 1970s, and her friend Barb goes back around the same time. If you know anything about this time period, you will know that civil rights literally just happened. They shot Martin Luther King literally a couple years ago. This is a charged time in the States for Black women, for Black people. And even aside from that, this is a charged time for veterans in general, and much more for Black veterans because of all the things that happened in the 60s. But we really don't even hear about that. We don't hear anything. We just get the character Barb being pigeonholed into the strong Black woman trope. She's a strong Black woman that's protesting and trying to fight for the right of veterans, which is commendable. She's fighting for the war to end as a veteran, but that's all we hear from Barb's character. We never hear about her complex thoughts and feelings around being a veteran or even being a patriot. Because for me, that would have been interesting. Barb is Black, and for years, the United States has failed Black people. For years, they have let Black people down, not treated them as people, and yet she went to serve her country in that capacity. It would have been interesting to see how she felt and what feelings she felt around being a Black patriot for a country that does not really respect her as a woman or a Black person especially. So that for me, major letdown. Not really exploring the experiences of other women that are different from the main character and only using them as a crutch to emotionally support her was disappointing. It was majorly disappointing for me, and that for me is why I had to rate this book 3 out of 5 stars. And don't get me wrong, I love romance plots, but I don't think that should have been the main focus of this book. When you have a book called The Women, I think that garners men taking a back seat and actually highlighting women and their experiences and how they felt rather than putting them in the background. It just, you would have thought. You would have thought they would have been the main focus in this book, but even in a book called The Women, we can only focus on men, which was a major disappointment for me, and which is why this book gets 3 out of 5 stars. But on a positive note, one reason why this book got 3 out of 5 stars in a positive note is because even though this book let me down about really doing the main thing that it said it was going to do, which is focus on the women, this book, on a broader level, got me to hear more themes, not hear more themes, but recognize more themes that went on in Vietnam, which is which was interesting for me because I got a lot of tidbits that I went on and researched after I read this book. One main thing that I was able to research was women's invisibility when coming home from Vietnam. Because one main trope that the main character experienced was that she was constantly turned away from seeking help for her PTSD from veterans clinics. Every time she went to a veteran clinic to seek help for her PTSD, they would turn her away because they didn't recognize her service. They didn't recognize the fact that women actually served in Vietnam. They would be like, "What do you mean you served in Vietnam? You're a woman." And she would be like, "I was a combat nurse." And they were like, "Yeah, you were a nurse. You weren't the one that was actually shooting guns at the front line. You weren't a man at the front line. You were a nurse. So that doesn't really count for nothing. You're not a veteran." And this complete neglect by her own country and by her own Veterans Association for me was insane. And I want to read for you a quote that I found from an article that was written by Pete Early and was published in 1981 in the Washington Post. It is titled, "The Effects of War on Female Vietnam Veterans Are Only Now Emerging." And the title should automatically even let you know 6 years after the Vietnam War ended, because it ended in 1975, 6 years after it ended, there are just being clinical studies being investigating how women were affected from the Vietnam War. 6 years on, this is the first time that women's experiences and their mental health issues are reaching the mainstream. And I want to read you a quote that was said by the former head of the Veterans Affairs Association that was meant to help veterans in their clinical issues. The former head of it at the time that this was written, published in 1981, was Julian Morrison. And she said, and I quote, "Only 2.3% of veterans are women. They are entitled to the same benefits as men, but it would be discriminatory to create programs just for them." End quote. Now, this quote really highlights the fact that the head of the Veterans Association at the time, well, the former head at the time that this was published, really didn't see the need in reaching out to women specifically, even in light of the fact that they were literally pushed out of programs that were available to all veterans and were thus only making these programs available to men. So women actually ended up going to private clinics and actually having to seek other avenues to face their PTSD. And some of them would just battle it alone, because if your own men and women's in arms are pushing you out of spaces that are meant to help you as a veteran, then it kind of isolates you from the public and makes you suffer with these mental health diseases in private. And this was horrible, and coupled with a much more nefarious fact that these veterans were ostracized and actually kind of hated by the public, because this was another theme that stood out to me in the book. The fact that the main character, Frankie, when she returned home, she actually resorted to hiding the fact that she was a Vietnam veteran. She would actually not tell people that she was a veteran, because when she actually did it at first, people would give her so much flack for it and actually just put so much animosity and hate towards her. And it was mainly because when I found in my research, this war was hated by the American public, because at this time there were so many protests against the atrocities that were being done in Vietnam by American soldiers. And the entirety, well, not the entirety, but a majority of the public in the States at the time was protesting and trying to force the government to end the war. So when Vietnam veterans would return home, all of this animosity against the government and their hatred for fighting a war that was putting so much atrocities in place, like Agent Orange, the chemical burns, all of this, and having to see this war televised on the TV every day, because this is the time of television and the rise of seeing color TV and all of these atrocities and TV wars. Having to see this war on the television every day and hating the fact that you are sending men and young boys over to this war that is committing atrocities of the people against the people that live in Vietnam, and also ending up in more deaths of American men and boys, and also fighting in a losing war. This does not bode well for the feelings that the American public had for veterans when they returned home. And I want to read another quote for you that was written in an article called Seeking Recognition, Becoming Citizens, Achievements and Grievances Among Former Combatants from Three Wars. And it was written by this woman named Johanna Soderstrom. I hope I pronounced her name right. She's a senior lecturer um, at the Uppsala University in Sweden, and she wrote this article that really focuses on the reintegration efforts that veterans had to face after coming home from participating in wars. And this quote really sums up all of the feelings of animosity and the isolation that veterans felt when they returned home. And I feel like she says it better than I can. So, start of quote. The Vietnam War was generally seen as achieving nothing, instead, perceived as a defeat, and politically controversial and morally unjust one at that. When they first came home, however, their veteran identity was associated with a lot of guilt. Thus, some kept quiet because they were ashamed of having participated in the war and the things they did during the war. End quote. Now, I don't think I can say it much better than she did. She literally wraps up all the feelings of shame and isolation that veterans felt, and the reasons why they hid the fact that they were veterans from the public, and all the feelings of animosity that the American public felt from having people in their vicinity that reminded them of the fact that their government was constantly supporting and pumping more people into Vietnam. That was a lost war and brought the country shame. I don't think I can say it much better than she did. And yeah, on that quote, that is actually all I have to say today about The Women by Kristin Hannah. And as I already said, I rate this book 3 out of 5 stars. I generally wouldn't recommend it to much people because I don't like to recommend books that I didn't really love. So I wouldn't really recommend much people to read this book. Maybe part one for me was really enjoyable, even though it did suffer from those things that I talked about in other parts of the episode, like not really highlighting women. But I would say you can read part one if you just like drama and you want to really read a fast paced plot. Part two, generally wouldn't recommend you to read it. The only reason that maybe I could see someone reading it is if they want to explore themes that happen to veterans upon returning and reintegrating after coming home from the war. And if you're a researcher, maybe that might be interesting to you, because I found it a bit interesting, even though I didn't really like the plot. It allowed me a lot of starting points to further research. So, yeah, that is my thoughts and feelings on part one and two. Part one, 4 out of 5 stars. Part two, kind of 1 star. Caveat, research points. Whole book, 3 out of 5 stars. And yeah, wouldn't really recommend it. I would say if you actually do want to read a book about women's experiences in Vietnam, I would say maybe choose another book. I feel like there is a lot of literature out there that better explores women's experiences in Vietnam and returning home from different socioeconomic statuses and different racial backgrounds, and just getting a wealth of many women's experiences outside of this book, I think is important, because this book just doesn't really go it just doesn't really do a good job at it, and I wouldn't recommend this book if that's what you're looking for. So yeah, that is all I have to say today about the women. If you want to hear some books that I actually do rate 5 out of 5 stars, I would say to go back through my catalog and the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Music and listen to some more episodes. But if you don't want to do that, then you can be right back here in 2 weeks on your platform of choice to hear me rate another book, movie, or TV show on C Talks.